Welcome back to the deep dive. This is where we take sometimes pretty dense material, research papers, textbooks, and really try to break it down into something clear, useful, and hopefully even a bit fun for you. Today, we're jumping into a space where math gets really physical, solving actual real-world puzzles. We're looking at Chapter 6 of Calculus, Early Transcendentals, the ninth edition by Stewart, Clegg, and Watson. And this chapter, it's all about taking that core idea, the definite integral we explored before, and just unleashing it, seeing what it can do on problems you can actually, picture.
Exactly. And our mission here really is to cut through the complexity. We want to break down these powerful ways integration is used step by step. And crucially, link them to things you might actually see or think about: physics problems, engineering designs, economic models, even stuff in biology. It's not about just learning formulas off by heart. It's about developing an intuition for how calculus helps us measure and understand the world, seeing it in action.
Yeah, and the amazing thing is there's this underlying method, this kind of master key that works for all these different types of problems. It's pretty elegant. So how does that work? Okay, let's unpack this bit.
Well, if you remember back in Chapter 5, we established the definite integral primarily for finding areas under curves, right, between the function and the x-axis. Chapter 6 basically says, okay, great start, but that idea is much bigger. It generalizes it. The integral isn't just for that one specific kind of area.
Right, and this general method they mentioned, it pops up everywhere in the chapter areas between curves, volumes, even calculating physical work. It feels, like they say, similar to the one we used to find areas under curves.
Mm-hmm.
The core idea, as I understand it, is you take whatever you want to measure, area, volume, work, whatever, and you slice it. You break it into loads of tiny, tiny pieces. Then you approximate the value for each tiny piece, like a little rectangle's area or a thin disk's volume. You add all those little approximations up. That's your Riemann sum. And then here's the calculus part. You take the limit as the pieces get infinitely small. Boom, it becomes a definite integral.
Precisely. That's the conceptual leap. And once you've successfully translated your problem into that definite integral, well, that's where the fundamental theorem of calculus comes back in. It's the tool you use to actually evaluate the integral. So you see, this chapter isn't standalone. It's constantly building on and using those really core concepts from earlier. It shows how interconnected calculus is.
Okay, so we have this powerful toolkit: slice, approximate sum, integrate. Where's the first place we really see this flex its muscles beyond just simple area under a curve?
Well, the most natural next step is looking at the area between two different curves. So instead of the x-axis being your floor, you've got another function defining the bottom edge.
Yeah, that makes intuitive sense.
Okay.
If you've got, say, y OAX sitting above y GX on some interval from a dB, the area trapped between them is just the integral of the top one minus the bottom one.
Right.
Integrate f of x from a to b. It's like you calculate the whole area under fx down to the axis. Then you just subtract the area under gx, leaving just the bit in the middle.
Exactly that. And visually, when you're sketching these out, which you absolutely should do first, think about drawing a skinny little vertical rectangle inside that region. Its height is just the top y value minus the bottom y value, so fx gx. Its width is a tiny bit of x, that integral. Summing the areas of all those infinitesimally thin rectangles gives you the integral, like finding the area between yx and yx from 0 to 1. You just integrate xx, or maybe between two parabolas, like y equals 2, y equals 2x by 2. First step is find where they cross. Those are your a and b. Then integrate the difference.
Okay, but finding where they cross, that's not always easy, is it? What if you have really messy functions? Like the book mentions y o x by 2 plus 1 and y equals by 4x. You can't just solve that by hand.
No, you definitely can't. Not easily anyway. And that's a really practical point. In real-world applications, or even just more complex textbook problems, finding those intersection points exactly might be impossible algebraically. That's where, tools like graphing calculators or computer algebra systems are essential. They can give you really accurate approximations for those intersection points, your a and b. Then you can set up the integral and approximate its value too. It's part of modern problem solving.
Right. And what happens if the curves swap places? If one starts on top, but then they cross over partway through the interval, like sine and cosine between 0 and pi 2. Cosine starts higher, then sine takes over after pi 4.
Ugh, good question. You can't just integrate fx gx straight across then. Because where gx is actually the top curve, that difference becomes negative and it would subtract from your total area. So the technically correct way is to integrate the absolute value of the difference, fx gx. But how you actually do that is you find the crossover points, like pi 4 in your sine cosine example. And you break the integral into pieces. You do one integral from 0 to pi 4, where cosine is on top, and another from pi 4 to pi 2, where sheac is on top. You just have to make sure you're always doing top curve, bottom curve in each piece.
Got it. So you split the problem at the intersections. Keep track of who's on top.
Exactly. Now, sometimes even doing that, setting things up with vertical rectangles, integrating with respect to x, can be awkward. Maybe the equations are just difficult to work with, or you'd need to split the region into many, many pieces.
And that's the cue, too. Turn your head sideways.
Oh.
Integrate with respect to y.
Precisely. If your region is defined more naturally by x as a function of y, so you have curves like x, fy, and x equals gy bounded by horizontal lines yc and yd, then you can use horizontal rectangles. The area is then the integral from c to d of right curve, left curve, or day, so xr, xl die. The book points out, and it's true, sometimes choosing to integrate with respect to y makes the calculation much easier. It avoids messy algebra or multiple integrals. Always worth considering both ways.
Okay, this is where it gets really interesting for me, the applications. How does finding the area between two lines on a graph actually tell us something useful?
Oh, in so many ways. Take engineering, or even just comparing cars. If you graph the velocity of car A and car B over time, assuming they start together, the area between those two velocity curves, VAT and VBT, represents the physical distance between the cars at the end of that time. It's not just abstract. Engineers might use numerical methods like the midpoint rule to estimate this area from speed data, maybe to analyze performance or safety. That area is a real distance.
Wow, okay, that's cool. And the biology example, measles. How does area relate to getting sick?
Yeah, this one's fascinating. Epidemiologists sometimes model disease progression with a pathogenesis curve. It might show, say, virus concentration over time. The area under parts of this curve, or between the curve and some baseline level, can actually quantify things like the total amount of infection needed to trigger symptoms, or even how infectious a person is over a period. The units might be something like cells per milliliter times days, so calculus helps measure the cumulative impact of the virus. It's a quantitative tool for understanding disease burden.
That's incredible, turning a disease progression into a number. And then there's the economic one, the Gini index. That
Yeah.
measures inequality, right?
Yes, the Gini index. It's a standard measure used worldwide, and it's based entirely on the area between two specific curves. You have the line YX, which represents perfect income equality, everyone earns the same. Then you have the actual Lorenz curve, YLLNX, which plots the cumulative share of income earned by the bottom X% of the population. The further the Lorenz curve dips below the line of perfect equality, the more inequality there is. The Gini index is derived directly from the area between those two curves.
So a bigger area means more inequality.
Exactly. The area is calculated, then scaled, usually to be between 0 and 1. 0 means perfect equality. The Lorenz curve is the line YX, and 1 means perfect inequality. One person has everything. So this single number, derived from an area calculation, gives economists and policymakers a snapshot of income distribution. It lets them compare countries, track changes over time. It's a really powerful application of the seemingly simple geometric idea.
Okay, so from 2D areas between curves, the next step is 3D volumes. How do we start thinking about the space inside a solid object?
Well, the simplest 3D object we understand is a cylinder, or maybe a rectangular box. Volume is just base area times height, V, oculi, V.
Ah,
That's our starting point.
Yeah.
But for more complicated shapes, we need that slicing idea again.
right, the slicing method, like slicing a weirdly shaped loaf of bread. You cut the solid into lots of very thin, parallel slices, perpendicular to some axis, say the x-axis. Each slice has some cross-sectional area, AX, which might change depending on where you slice it, and a tiny thickness. The volume of that one slice is roughly AX. Then you sum them all up with an integral. Volume equals the integral of AX dx from one end of the solid to the other. Same principle as area, just adding up volumes of slices instead of areas of rectangles.
Perfect. And a beautiful classic example is deriving the volume of a sphere. If you slice a sphere of radius r perpendicular to, say, the x-axis, each slice is a circle. Using Pythagoras, you can figure out the radius of the circular slice at position x. It turns out to be square key r 2 by 2. So the area of that slice, ax, is pi times that radius squared, or r2 by 2. You integrate that area function from x plus r to x plus r, and out pops the famous 43 r3. It confirms a known formula using this general slicing method.
That's neat. And this method really shines with solids of revolution, right? Shapes you get by spinning a 2D area around an axis. If the area you spin is right up against the axis, the slices are just solid circles, disks. Their area is just Kyre's radius too.
Correct. But if there's a gap between the region you're rotating and the axis of rotation, or if the region itself has a hole in it, then when you slice it, you don't get solid disks. You get washers, like flat donuts or annular rings. To find the area of a washer, you take the area of the big outer circle and subtract the area of the inner hole. So the cross-sectional area is outer radius 2 to UGA radius 2. The absolute trickiest part here, especially when rotating around lines that aren't the x or y axis, like rotating around y's toe or x1, is correctly identifying those outer and inner radii from your sketch. A good, clear diagram is absolutely essential. You really have to visualize it.
So if I were designing, say, a part with a hole through it, maybe a complex shape, this washer method lets me calculate its volume exactly.
Yes, precisely. And remember, slicing works even if the solid isn't made by revolution. Imagine a solid whose base is a circle, but the cross-sections perpendicular to the base are squares, or maybe equilateral triangles. You'd still find the formula for the cross-sectional area AX and integrate it. The method works for pyramids too. The cross-sections are similar shapes whose area changes as you go up. It's all about integrating that cross-sectional area.
Okay, but sometimes disks or washers are just hard work.
Yeah.
Or maybe even impossible, algebraically.
That definitely happens. The main issue is usually if you need to solve the equation of the curve for the other variable. Like if you have y as some complicated function of x, say y equals 2 by 2 by 3, and you want to rotate around the y-axis, using washers would mean slicing horizontally. That requires you to find x in terms of y. Solving y equals 2 by 2 by 3 for x is, well, not something you want to do if you can avoid it.
Okay, so we need plan B, which is cylindrical shells. This sounds different. Instead of perpendicular slices, we use cylinders.
Exactly, the method of cylindrical shells. Instead of slicing perpendicular to the axis of rotation, think about taking a thin vertical rectangle within your 2D region, if rotating around the axis, and spinning that rectangle around the axis. It sweeps out a thin hollow cylinder, a shell. The clever part is figuring out the volume of one shell. It's approximately 2 times average radius times height.
Times,
Thickness.
oh wait, I think I see it. If you imagine cutting that shell vertically and unrolling it, it becomes like a flat rectangle, right? The length is the circumference, 2 kilos. The height is just the height of the original rectangle, and the thickness is the tiny cax or oi width, so circumference x, height x, thickness. That makes sense.
That's a great way to visualize it. And it often simplifies things enormously. If you're rotating the area under y, ffx, from a TB around the y-axis, a typical shell has radius x, height fx, and thickness dx. So the volume is just the integral from a to b of 2pex fx. Notice you didn't have to solve for x in terms of y. You stick with the original function fx. It can be much, much easier.
And it's flexible, too. You can use shells for rotating around the x-axis as well.
Absolutely. You just reorient your thinking. If rotating around the x-axis, you typically use horizontal rectangles, the thickness dodi. The shell radius would be y, and the height would be the horizontal width of the rectangle, maybe x right, x left. So you'd integrate 2 height function of y.
This leads to the big question then. Disks washers versus shells. How do you choose? It feels like a crucial decision point.
It is. It's strategic. There's no single always use this rule. You have to look at the specific problem. Ask yourself, which variable, x or y, makes the function equations easier to work with? Do I have y fx or is x gy simpler? Which way are the limits of integration easier to find? Will one method force me to split the integral into multiple parts while the other lets me do it in one go? And, maybe most importantly, which resulting integral looks easier to actually calculate? My best tip: always sketch the region. Then draw a sample rectangle, either vertical or horizontal. Imagine rotating that rectangle. Does it naturally form a disk washer if it's perpendicular to the axis of rotation, or a shell if it's parallel? That visual clue often points you to the easier method.
Okay, that's super helpful advice. Let's switch gears again. Another huge application. Work. Physics definition time. If force is constant, work is just force times distance. Simple enough. Joules, foot-pounds, got it. But force usually isn't constant, is it?
Rarely in interesting situations. Think about stretching a spring, lifting a chain, pumping water. The force involved changes. That's where calculus comes in again. If the force Fx varies as an object moves from xa to xb, you can't just multiply. You imagine the work done over a tiny distance dx, where the force is almost constant Ffx. That tiny bit of work is dwfx dx. To get the total work, you guessed it, you integrate. W equals integral from a to b of fx dx. You're summing up the work done over all the tiny displacements.
And this lets us tackle some classic physics problems, like Hooke's law for springs. Force is proportional to distance stretched, Fx, Ax. So the force changes as you stretch it.
Exactly. To find the work done stretching a spring from, say, its natural length to 2 inches further, you'd integrate Tx dx from 0 to 2, making sure units are consistent.
Okay.
Same idea applies to lifting a heavy cable or chain. As you pull it up, there's less chain hanging down, so the weight, the force you need to overcome, decreases. You have to set up an integral that accounts for the weight of the remaining part of the chain at each height x.
Okay, and now the ones that always seem the trickiest. Pumping liquids out of tanks. This is where it gets really interesting and maybe a bit complicated.
They can be challenging, definitely, but the principle is the same. Slice, approximate, integrate. Imagine a tank may be conical, spherical, cylindrical, full of water, and you need to pump it all out over the top edge. The key is to slice the water horizontally into thin layers or discs, for one thin layer at a certain depth. First, figure out its volume, area of the slice thickness d, then figure out its weight, volume density gravity, that's the force needed to lift just that layer. Then figure out the distance that specific layer needs to be lifted to get out of the tank. This distance usually depends on the depth of the slice. The work for that one slice is force for the slice, distance for the slice. Finally, you integrate that expression over the entire depth of the water.
Wow, okay. So each layer needs a different amount of work because it might weigh differently if the tank sides aren't vertical, and it definitely travels a different distance.
Precisely. It combines volume calculations, force calculations, weight, and distance, all wrapped up in one integral. It's a fantastic application synthesis. And think about the scale the book mentions in an exercise estimating the total work done building the Great Pyramid. You'd model lifting each layer of stones, considering their weight and the height they were lifted. Calculus lets you tackle these enormous historical engineering problems.
That's mind-blowing. Okay, one last concept from the chapter, average value. If I measure the temperature outside constantly all day long, how do I find the average temperature? It's not like I have a finite list of numbers to add up and divide.
Exactly. You have infinitely many data points if it's a continuous measurement. Calculus gives us the definition for the average value of a function fx over an interval ab. It's defined as favgie times the integral of fx dx from a to b. You integrate the function over the interval and then divide by the length of the interval.
And there's a cool way to think about this visually, right? The geometric interpretation. It's like the area under the curve, fx from a to b, is equal to the area of a rectangle with the same base, ba, and a height equal to this average value, fag. The book has that great analogy. You can chop off the top of a two-dimensional mountain and use it to fill in the valleys so that the mountain becomes completely flat. That flat height is the average value.
That's a perfect analogy. It captures the idea of distributing the function's value evenly over the interval. And importantly, the mean value theorem for integrals guarantees that if f is continuous, there must be some point c within the interval ab where the function's actual value fc is equal to this average value fad. The function actually hits its average value somewhere.
So for you listening, this isn't just abstract math. It means we can find the true average velocity of a car on a trip, even with speeding up and slowing down. We can find the average temperature over 24 hours from a continuous sensor reading, or the average power usage. It gives precision to the idea of average for things that change continuously. So looking back, we've covered a huge amount of ground. We started with this core idea of slicing and summing via integration, and saw how it unlocks calculating areas between curves, volumes of complex solids using disks, washers, and shells, the physical work done by variable forces, even lifting chains and pumping water, and finally finding the true average value of something that changes constantly. We've seen it applied in engineering, physics, biology, economics with the Gini index, even estimating the work on the pyramids.
It really highlights how the definite integral isn't just one tool, but a whole Swiss Army knife for tackling problems where things accumulate or change continuously. And it emphasizes that these aren't just separate techniques. They're all built on that same fundamental limit process from the definition of the integral, and they constantly connect back to earlier concepts like the fundamental theorem, while also paving the way for more advanced topics later in calculus and beyond. It's all interconnected.
So here's a thought to leave you with. Now that you've seen how integration can measure the space between curves, the volume of shapes, the work involved in lifting things, how might that change how you perceive the physical world? Do you see potential integrals hiding in the curve of a bridge, the flow of traffic, or even the growth of a plant? Keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep taking the deep dive.